In the vast, silent archives of history, amidst the treaties signed and the battlefields consecrated, there are stories that lie dormant, waiting for the light. They are not tales of grand strategy or political conquest, but of the human heart, caught in the unforgiving gears of a world gone mad. We look at the faded photographs of royalty, at the palaces of stone and the crowns of jewel, and we imagine a life shielded from the brutalities of the common experience. But history, in its most honest moments, teaches a different, more terrible lesson. It teaches that sometimes a palace is merely a more ornate prison. Sometimes a crown is not a shield, but a bullseye. Today we undertake a deep and unflinching journey into the life of one of the most quietly extraordinary and resilient figures of the modern royal era. She was not a reigning queen, nor was her story one of scandal or abdication. Hers is a more profound narrative, a story of endurance across a chasm of unimaginable change. She was a living bridge, her life beginning in the gaslit, horse-drawn world of Queen Victoria and ending in the atomic age of Margaret Thatcher. She was the last surviving grandchild of that formidable empress, a witness to 6 reigns, 2 world wars, and the slow dismantling of the very empire she was born to represent. Her name was Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone. Her life should have been a symphony of privilege and placid duty. Instead, it was a composition scored with the recurring sorrowful motif of loss. It was a life defined by the shadow of a father she never knew, by the heart-wrenching agony of seeing her only brother become an enemy of her country, and by the relentless ticking of a genetic time bomb, a royal curse that claimed the 2 men she was meant to love the longest. Her story is an odyssey that takes us from the solemn velvet-draped corridors of Windsor Castle to the sun-scorched plains of South Africa and the snow-covered landscapes of wartime Canada. To follow her path is to confront aching questions. How does one reconcile the love for a sibling with loyalty to one's nation in a time of total war? How does a mother bear the knowledge that she has passed a fatal inheritance to her own son? What is the nature of duty when it demands a lifetime of service in the wake of relentless personal grief? This is more than the forgotten chronicle of a princess. It is a meticulous examination of human fortitude under unimaginable pressure, a testament to the quiet strength required to live a public life while nursing private wounds, and a solemn reminder that the longest lives are often those that contain the most sorrow. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that thumbs up, letting us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribing so you won't miss out on our future explorations into the forgotten corners of history. A Gilded Cage, the Victorian Inheritance. To truly understand the woman Alice would become, stoic, dutiful, and possessed of an almost unbreakable will, we must first immerse ourselves in the world that forged her. This was the absolute zenith of the Victorian era, the late 19th century, a time of immense, almost overwhelming contradiction. It was an age when the British Empire, a vast patchwork of territories painted red on the globe, projected an image of unshakable power and moral certainty. Its social codes, dictated from the palaces of London and the country houses of the aristocracy, seemed as immutable as granite. This was a world of steam and steel, of new technologies like the telephone and electric light, beginning to flicker in the homes of the wealthy, creating a dazzling veneer of progress. Yet beneath this gilded surface of industrial might and imperial confidence, a deep-seated anxiety lingered. It was the fin de siècle, the end of the century, and a palpable sense of an era's passing hung in the air. For every grand townhouse in Mayfair, There were sprawling, disease-ridden slums in the East End. For every pronouncement of moral superiority, there were whispers of decadence and decay. At the very apex of this complex world sat the royal family. It was no longer the House of Hanover, but the German-descended House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a dynasty that, under Queen Victoria, had become the very emblem of Britishness. And within this family, a private affliction coursed silently through the royal veins, a secret whispered in palace corridors, a genetic flaw that would come to define the first and most profound tragedy of Princess Alice's life. Alice Mary Victoria Augusta. Pauline was born on February 25, 1883, within the formidable gray stone walls of Windsor Castle, the ancient fortress that was the ultimate symbol of the monarchy's power and endurance. She was not just another titled aristocrat in a sea of them. She was a granddaughter of the Queen Empress herself, a child born into the very epicenter of global power. Her father was Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, the eighth of Victoria's 9 children, and by all accounts the most intellectually gifted. In a family that prized military bearing and masculine action, Leopold was a man apart. His older brothers, like the Prince of Wales, were men of the world, known for their appetites and robust constitutions. Leopold, by contrast, was a scholar, an aesthete, a deeply sensitive soul with a restless, questioning mind. He was the family's academic, a chess enthusiast who could play multiple games simultaneously while blindfolded, a president of the Royal Society of Literature, and a passionate patron of the arts. He sought out the company of the era's great minds, forming a close bond with the influential art critic John Ruskin, whose ideas about the moral purpose of art and the dignity of the craftsman deeply resonated with the prince's own sensibilities. Leopold was, in every meaningful way, the true inheritor of his own father, Prince Albert's intellectual curiosity and reforming zeal. But nature had played a cruel trick on Leopold. He was also marked by tragedy from birth. He was the first of Victoria's descendants to suffer from haemophilia, the royal disease, a terrifying genetic disorder passed down from the Queen herself that prevented blood from clotting properly. His life was a constant, careful negotiation with mortality. While his brothers could hunt, ride, and serve in the military, Leopold's world was circumscribed by his fragility. Every fall, every bump, every minor scrape that a normal child would shake off carried for him the risk of a severe, uncontrollable bleed, agonizing pain, and potential death. This reality shaped his existence and his mother's reaction to him. The Queen, who adored her brilliant but delicate son, smothered him in a protective embrace that often felt like a cage. He was her invalid prince, a label that chafed against his keen and active mind, which longed for a meaningful role in the affairs of state that was consistently denied him. He yearned to be useful, but was forced into a life of careful observation. In 1882, Leopold found a measure of the happiness and freedom he craved when he married Princess Helen of Waldeck and Pyrmont. Helen was not a dazzling beauty from one of the grand royal houses of Europe. She came from a small, respectable, and relatively impoverished German principality, a place valued by Queen Victoria as a source of sensible, well-educated, and unspoiled Protestant princesses. Helen's own sister, Emma, had already become the respected Queen of the Netherlands. Helen was chosen specifically for her formidable intellect, her steady character, and her quiet strength, seen as the perfect calming influence for the Queen's nervous and fragile son. But their bond was far more than a dynastic arrangement. She was not just his nursemaid, she was his intellectual partner. She shared his passion for learning and the arts, creating a true partnership of minds and hearts. Their union produced their first child, Alice, the following year. For a brief, blissful moment, it seemed Leopold had finally carved out a space for the domestic peace and intellectual companionship he had always craved. This peace was shattered with shocking and brutal suddenness. In February 1884, seeking the warmer climate of the French Riviera to ease his chronic joint pain, Leopold traveled to Cannes. On the afternoon of March 27th, while at a private club, the Cercle Nautique, he slipped on a stone staircase and fell, injuring his knee and striking his head. The initial injury did not seem severe, but for a haemophiliac, the real damage was internal. The blow to his head had caused a cerebral hemorrhage. He died in the early hours of the next morning. He was only 30 years old. Princess Alice back in England was just over a year old, too young to ever form a memory of her father's face or voice. Her brother, Charles Edward, would be born 4 months later, a posthumous child, a Duke of Albany from the moment of his birth, who would never meet the man whose title he inherited. Alice, therefore, grew up in a household fundamentally defined by this loss. Her mother, the widowed Duchess Helen, was a woman of immense fortitude, who, rather than retreating into obscurity, devoted herself to her children and to creating a living memorial to her late husband. Alice and her younger brother Charles Edward were raised in the relative seclusion of Claremont House, a grand Palladian mansion in Surrey that had once belonged to Clive of India. The atmosphere at Claremont was unique. It was a household steeped in the formal, somber rituals of a court in perpetual mourning for a lost prince. Yet, it was also filled with a deep, nurturing maternal love. The house was a shrine to Leopold's passions. Lined with his books and art, his presence kept alive through the stories and ideals his widow instilled in their children. In this enclosed world, an incredibly powerful, unbreakable bond was forged between the two fatherless siblings. They were not just brother and sister. They were allies, playmates, and confidants, a self-contained unit united by their unique and tragic position within the royal family. They were the Queen's cherished grandchildren, yes, but they were also a constant living reminder of her beloved lost son, a fact that colored their entire youth. Their upbringing was also overseen by the watchful and often intimidating eye of Queen Victoria herself. They spent considerable time with their grandmother at Windsor, at Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands, and at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. For Alice and Charlie, Victoria was not just a distant, formidable monarch. She was a grandmother who held a special, poignant affection for them. Having lost her own consort, Prince Albert, so early, she felt a profound sympathy for her widowed daughter-in-law and her fatherless grandchildren. She would tell them stories of their dear papa, ensuring his memory was never forgotten. But this special affection also came with a heavy weight of expectation. Alice, in particular, was expected to absorb the rigid protocols, the sense of religious piety, and the unshakable sense of duty that defined the Victorian court. But alongside this education in royal responsibility came the knowledge of a more sinister, invisible inheritance. Alice, like her father, was part of hemophilia's tragic story. Medical understanding was still developing, but the pattern was becoming clear. It was a condition passed down by mothers who were themselves unaffected to their sons. Alice was a carrier. This scientific fact was a quiet, terrifying knowledge that she carried within her from a young age. She understood that while she was safe, any son she might one day have could inherit the full-blown, fatal condition. This royal curse had already begun its devastating march through the courts of Europe, most famously afflicting the precious heir to the Russian throne, Tsarevich Alexei. His mother, Empress Alexandra, was another of Victoria's granddaughters, and her desperate attempts to find a cure for her son would lead her into the clutches of the mystic Rasputin, destabilizing the entire Romanov dynasty. For Alice, the fear of passing on this legacy of pain and early death was not an abstract possibility. It was a clear and present danger that cast a long, dark shadow over her future happiness and her primary dynastic duty to marry and produce a healthy heir. A fateful union and a brother's divergent path. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the rigid, black-clad world of Queen Victoria's final years dissolved into the vibrant, glittering era of her son, King Edward VII. The Edwardian period is often remembered as a long golden afternoon, a final extravagant burst of aristocratic confidence and pleasure before the cataclysm of the First World War. This was an age of opulent house parties that lasted for weeks, of the first sputtering, unreliable motor cars, terrifying horses on country lanes, and of a glittering social scene presided over by a genial, pleasure-loving king. Edward's court was a world away from his mother's dour and pious one. It was faster, more glamorous, and decidedly more tolerant of personal indiscretions. It was in this glittering, slightly reckless world that Princess Alice came of age. She emerged from the cloistered, scholarly upbringing at Claremont into society as a strikingly attractive and vivacious young woman. But she was more than just another pretty royal. She was noted for her sharp intelligence and an independent spirit that was somewhat unusual for a princess of her time, a legacy, perhaps, of her intellectual father and her strong-willed mother. She was less interested in the frivolous gossip of the Marlborough house set, and more engaged with the arts, literature, and the changing world around her, possessing a directness and curiosity that set her apart. In 1904, a suitable and highly desirable match was made. Alice married Prince Alexander of Teck in the magnificent setting of St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the very same venue where her own parents had exchanged their brief, tragic vows. On the surface, Prince Alexander, known affectionately as Algy to his family, was the perfect royal consort. He was a handsome, steady, and capable cavalry officer in the Royal Horse Guards, a solid and dependable figure who seemed to embody the very model of a British royal soldier. But the match was more than just suitable. It was strategic. Critically, Algy was deeply embedded within the royal family's inner circle. His sister was the serene and steadfast Princess Mary of Teck, who had married the future King George V. This made Algy the brother-in-law of the heir to the throne, placing him and his new bride not on the periphery of royalty, but at its very heart. This was no distant dynastic alliance designed to secure a foreign border. It was a consolidation of the core of the British establishment. The Teck family itself had a slightly complex lineage. Algy's father, Francis, Duke of Teck, was the product of a morganatic marriage within the German royal house of Württemberg, meaning he did not have succession rights. He had come to England and married Queen Victoria's first cousin, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, a granddaughter of King George III. Algy was therefore royal on his mother's side, but carried a German ducal title from his father. He was a man who had already proven his mettle, having served with distinction in the Second Boer War in South Africa, a brutal conflict that had given him first-hand experience of modern warfare. He was not a drawing-room soldier, but a seasoned veteran. Their union promised a future of influence, security, and impeccable standing. Their early married life was one of comfort and purpose, filled with the expected round of royal duties, charity patronages, and social engagements that defined a popular and active young royal couple. But while Alice's life path seemed securely set on a comfortable, predictable course within the British orbit, a twist of dynastic fate dictated a dramatically different and ultimately tragic journey for her beloved brother, Charles Edward. In 1899, a succession crisis brewed in Germany. The reigning Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Alfred, who was Queen Victoria's second son and thus Alice's uncle, lost his only son and heir. A successor was needed for the German duchy that had ironically been the original home of the British royal house. The next in line was Queen Victoria's third son, Arthur, the Duke of Connaught. But by the turn of the century, with Anglo-German relations growing increasingly tense over naval arms races and colonial rivalries, the idea of a senior British prince and serving field marshal also being a reigning German sovereign was becoming politically untenable. The Duke of Connaught and his own son, Prince Arthur, formally renounced their claim to the duchy. The line of succession therefore passed down to the next branch of the family, the orphaned children of Prince Leopold. As a result, in 1900, the 16-year-old Charles Edward, a boy raised in the gentle green landscape of Surrey, speaking English as his first language, was abruptly uprooted from his home, his country, and his sister. He was sent to Germany to be groomed as the next sovereign of a German state. It was a staggering, life-altering turn of events. Imagine a teenage boy whose entire world had been his widowed mother and his adoring sister, being told he must now leave it all behind. He was taken from Eton College and sent to Germany, where he became His Royal Highness Duke Karl Eduard of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The Germanization process was swift and total. He was enrolled at the University of Bonn to study law and economics, and entered the Prussian army to learn the rigid discipline expected of a German prince, all under the watchful eye of his cousin, the bombastic Kaiser Wilhelm II. He had to perfect his German and shed his English habits, all while under immense pressure to prove himself to a skeptical court and to his new subjects. For Alice, this was a profound and painful separation. The sibling who had been her constant companion was now in a different country, being molded by a different culture. Though they maintained a loving correspondence and visited whenever possible, their lives were now set on divergent national tracks. In 1905, Charles Edward solidified his new identity by marrying a German princess, Victoria Adelaide of Schleswig-Holstein, and soon began his own family, raising his children as thoroughly German. By all accounts, he assimilated well, working hard at his duties and becoming a popular and conscientious ruler in his domains. This situation of a brother and sister belonging to two different and increasingly rivalrous nations was a perfect illustration of the complex, interwoven nature of European royalty before 1914. It was a continent governed by a sprawling family of cousins. King George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were all first cousins. They attended each other's weddings, funerals, and coronations, holidaying together and writing affectionate letters signed Georgie, Willie, and Nicky. But this web of kinship, once seen as a guarantee of peace, was proving to be a fragile defense against the rising aggressive tides of nationalism, imperial ambition, and the rigid interlocking military alliances that were pulling the continent towards war. The glittering state visits masked the secret military planning taking place in the halls of power. Alice and Charles Edward, once inseparable, were now citizens of two great powers on a collision course. Their personal bond, forged in the shared tragedy of their childhood, was about to be tested by a global conflict that would demand an ultimate, terrible, and unnatural choice of loyalty. The Great War, a house divided against itself. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 was the political spark that ignited the European powder keg. In the heady, naive days of August, a wave of patriotic fervor swept across the continent. In London, Berlin, and Paris, crowds cheered, waved flags, and sang national anthems as their young men, convinced of a swift and glorious victory, marched off to a war they believed would be over by Christmas. For the citizens of Britain and Germany, it was a clear and righteous call to arms. But for Princess Alice, living at the heart of the British royal family, the declaration of war was not a trumpet blast of patriotism. It was the sounding of a funeral dirge for her own family. It was the beginning of a private, 4-year-long nightmare that would demand an impossible sacrifice. The war did not present her with an abstract, faceless enemy. It placed the two most important men in her life on a collision course, turning her family into a tragic microcosm of the fratricidal horror engulfing Europe. On one side stood her husband, Prince Alexander of Teck, a decorated and professional soldier with a distinguished career in the British Army. As a man who had dedicated his life to the service of the crown, there was no question of his duty. He immediately resumed active service with his regiment, the 2nd Life Guards, and was dispatched to the Western Front in Flanders. There, amidst the mud and carnage of the trenches, he served with unwavering courage and distinction. He was not a distant commander, but a leader who shared the dangers of his men, earning multiple mentions in dispatches for his gallantry and leadership during brutal engagements like the Second Battle of Ypres. He was the very picture of a loyal British officer facing the daily hell of artillery bombardments, poison gas attacks, and the constant grinding threat of death that consumed a generation. His entire existence was dedicated to a single, clear objective: the total defeat of the German Empire. On the other side stood her only brother, the man who had been her childhood confidant and closest ally, Duke Karl Edward of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. As a sovereign German prince and a commissioned officer in the Prussian army, he was legally and morally bound to his own nation and to his commander-in-chief, Kaiser Wilhelm II. He donned the field gray uniform of the Kaiser's army and, as a general in the Saxon infantry, became an active and visible leader on the German side of the conflict. While his sovereign status often kept him from the front-line command held by professional soldiers, he was deeply involved in the German war effort, inspecting his troops, visiting military hospitals, and embodying the fighting spirit of his duchy. The unbearable, sickening reality for Alice was that every British victory her husband fought for was a defeat for her brother. Every German advance that her brother supported threatened the life of her husband. Her heart became a battlefield, torn between her desperate prayers for the man she had married and her deep, lifelong affection for the brother who had been her childhood rock. As the war began, all direct communication was severed. There could be no more letters, no telegrams, only a dreadful, agonizing silence, punctuated by the cold, impersonal reports in the daily newspapers. She would have scanned the casualty lists with a double-edged terror, dreading to see the names of her husband's friends and fellow officers, while simultaneously reading accounts of battles on the eastern and western fronts where her brother's troops were engaged. Each report was a potential site of a tragic, unimaginable family confrontation, a possibility too horrific to contemplate, yet impossible to ignore. Back in Britain, the initial patriotic fervor curdled into a wave of virulent anti-German hysteria as the war dragged on and the casualty lists grew ever longer. Anything and anyone with German connections became an object of suspicion and hatred. German-owned shops in London's East End were looted and burned. The music of Bach and Beethoven was, in some places, unofficially banned. Even the popular Dachshund breed was vilified as a German dog. This public fury inevitably turned towards the royal family itself. King George V, a man of unimpeachable British patriotism, found himself in an impossible position, ruling a country at war with Germany while bearing the very German surname of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The press, led by prominent figures like the author H.G. Wells, who referred to Britain's alien and uninspiring court, began to openly question the royal family's loyalties. The situation reached a crisis point in 1917 when German bombers began raiding London. These planes were the Gotha G4, heavy bombers built by a company that shared its name with the king's own house. The irony was savage, and the public relations damage was immense. The king knew he had to act decisively. In a brilliant act of political necessity and a genuine expression of his own identity, on July 17, 1917, King George V issued a royal proclamation. He renounced all German titles and dignities for himself and all members of his family. He declared that his royal house would no longer be known as the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, but would henceforth be known by the quintessentially English and deeply symbolic name of the House of Windsor, after the ancient castle that was its home. This single act reshaped the public identity of the British monarchy forever, severing its German roots in the most public way possible. This had immediate and direct consequences for Princess Alice and her family. The name Teck, her husband's title, was German. Following the king's lead, Prince Alexander relinquished his German princely rank. In its place, the king created for him and his brother British peerages. Alexander became Sir Alexander Cambridge, 1st Earl of Athlone, and Viscount Tremettin. Alice, a British princess by birth, was now officially styled Her Royal Highness Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone. While this solidified their British identity, another simultaneous act formalized her brother's disgrace. The government passed the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917, a law that gave it the power to strip enemy peers of their British titles and dignities. The first and most prominent name on the list of those to be investigated was His Royal Highness Charles Edward, Duke of Albany. In 1919, the act was finalized. His name was struck from the roll of the Order of the Garter, the highest order of chivalry, and his banner was physically removed from St. George's Chapel. The separation was now complete, legally formalized, and brutally public. He was officially an enemy of the state, a traitor in the eyes of the country of his birth. Throughout this period of almost unimaginable personal strain, Alice did not shrink from her public role. On the contrary, she channeled her anxiety and grief into relentless, punishing war work. She trained as a nurse with the Red Cross, becoming commandant of the Princess Alice Military Hospital in Essex, and worked for countless hours in other hospitals, tending to the horrifically wounded soldiers returning from the front. With her own hands, she dressed the wounds of men who had been maimed and gassed by the very army in which her brother served. The psychological complexity of her situation is almost impossible to fathom, offering comfort and healing to the victims of a conflict that implicated her own blood. Her work was more than a distraction. It was a fierce and public affirmation of her identity. It was her way of screaming to the world and perhaps to herself that her loyalty was and always would be with Britain. When the armistice was finally signed in November 1918, a wave of jubilant relief swept the Allied nations. For Alice, it must have been a profoundly mixed moment. Overwhelming joy for her country's victory and her husband's survival, but also a deep, hollow sadness for her brother's defeat and disgrace. The war had created a chasm between them that time would never bridge, a wound that would only be deepened and poisoned by his disastrous political choices in the years to come. The curse fulfilled, a mother's ultimate grief. The end of the Great War ushered in the Roaring Twenties, a decade of frantic energy, social upheaval, and a desperate desire to forget the horrors of the trenches. For Princess Alice and her husband, the Earl of Athlone, it was a time to rebuild their lives and focus on their family. The political storm had passed, but the private genetic storm that haunted her bloodline was merely lying dormant. Having endured the torment of a family divided by war, Alice was about to face a tragedy that was in some ways even more cruel, one that struck not at her loyalties, but at the very core of her being as a mother. Alice and Alexander had 3 children. Their daughter, Lady May Cambridge, born in 1906, was a healthy and happy child. A second son, Maurice, had died in infancy in 1910. The future of their line, the heir to the earldom of Athlone, was their surviving son, Rupert, who was born in 1907. Rupert was everything his parents could have hoped for. He was a handsome, charming, and intelligent boy who inherited his mother's spirit and his father's sense of duty. But from his first moments, he also carried the family's dreaded secret. It was soon confirmed that Rupert, like his grandfather Leopold, whom he never knew, had haemophilia. His childhood was a careful balance between protection and freedom. Alice, knowing the constant danger, lived with a fear that only a parent in her position could understand. Every fall in the nursery, every playground tumble, was a potential catastrophe. Yet she was determined that Rupert not be a prisoner of his condition, as her own father had often been. He was raised to be as active as was safely possible, and he grew into a vibrant young man, full of life and a longing for the normal experiences that were denied to him. He attended Eton College and went up to Trinity College, Cambridge, where he was a popular student. He developed a passion for the great thrill of the age, the motor car. For a young man whose body could not heal itself properly, a love of speed was a flirtation with disaster. In the spring of 1928, the family's worst fears were realized. Rupert, then just 20 years old, was on a driving holiday in France with 2 university friends. On April 15th, near the town of Belleville-sur-Saône, the car in which they were traveling was involved in an accident. His 2 friends sustained only minor injuries. Rupert himself seemed to have escaped with what was initially thought to be a slight concussion. He hit his head, but there was no major visible wound. However, for a haemophiliac, the most dangerous injuries are internal. The impact had caused a slow bleed on the brain, a cerebral hemorrhage. He was taken to a local hospital, but in 1928, medical science was powerless against such a condition. There were no clotting factors, no transfusions that could halt the inexorable internal bleeding. When Alice and Alexander received the news, they rushed from England to his bedside in France. There, they were forced to endure the most agonizing ordeal a parent can face, watching their child slowly die, helpless to intervene. For Alice, it was a horrific, nightmarish echo of the past. 4 decades earlier, her own mother had kept a similar vigil for her father, Leopold, after an almost identical injury. The curse had come full circle, striking down another generation's brightest hope. After days of fading consciousness, Rupert Cambridge, Viscount Tremetton, died on April 15th, 1928. He was 2 weeks shy of his 21st birthday. The grief was absolute. For Alice, it was compounded by a terrible, irrational sense of guilt. She had passed this fatal inheritance to her son. In her memoirs, written many years later, she would write of this time with a characteristic lack of self-pity, but the pain is palpable between the lines. She wrote of the terrible blank his death left, of a future erased in an instant. She had now lost a father and a son to the same cruel twist of genetic fate. Yet again, rather than allowing grief to consume her, she transformed it. The loss of Rupert seemed to instill in her and her husband an even deeper resolve to dedicate their lives to public service. They had lost their heir, and their personal future had been irrevocably altered. In response, they turned their full attention to the future of the nation and the empire they served. Sacred in the call of duty, the vicereine. In the wake of such profound loss, many would have retreated into a private world of grief. Alice and Alexander Athlone chose the opposite path. They embraced a life of relentless public duty, a commitment that would see them become two of the most respected and successful viceregal representatives of their era. They found not an escape from their sorrow, but a purpose through it, dedicating the next chapter of their lives to the service of the crown in two of the most important dominions of the British Empire. Their first major appointment came even before Rupert's death, but their service took on a new poignancy after it. In 1924, the Earl of Athlone was appointed Governor-General of the Union of South Africa. This was a challenging post. South Africa was a complex and racially stratified society, still nursing the wounds of the Boer War and grappling with the nascent competing nationalisms of its British and Afrikaner white populations, while its black majority was systematically disenfranchised. Alice, as vicereine, threw herself into her role with characteristic energy and a surprising lack of formality. She was determined to be more than a figurehead confined to Government House in Pretoria or Cape Town. She and her husband embarked on extensive tours, including a remarkable 2,000-mile journey by motorcar through the vast, arid landscapes of the Karoo. She made a genuine effort to connect with all of South Africa's peoples, learning phrases in Afrikaans and some indigenous languages, a gesture that was almost unheard of for a royal representative at the time. She developed a deep love for the African bush, its wildlife, and its people, becoming a passionate advocate for environmental conservation. Her direct, unpretentious manner and keen sense of humor won over many who were skeptical of the British monarchy. When their term ended in 1931, they left behind a reservoir of goodwill, having navigated a deeply complex political landscape with grace and genuine empathy. Their greatest test, however, came with the outbreak of the Second World War. In 1940, as Britain faced its darkest hour, standing alone against the might of Nazi Germany, King George VI asked his uncle, the Earl of Athlone, to serve as Governor-General of Canada. This was no mere ceremonial appointment. It was a mission of supreme strategic and symbolic importance. With the threat of a German invasion of Britain very real, Canada was the senior dominion, a vital partner in the war effort, and the potential refuge for the royal family itself should the worst happen. The presence of the king's own aunt and uncle in Ottawa was a powerful symbol of the unbreakable bond between Britain and the Commonwealth. Alice and Alexander arrived in Canada to a nation mobilizing for total war. Alice, now in her late 50s, once again demonstrated her incredible stamina and dedication. She traveled thousands of miles across the country by train and by plane, visiting munitions factories, shipyards, air bases, and hospitals. Her purpose was to bolster morale, to thank the workers and soldiers, and to embody the steadfast resolve of the British people. She was particularly active in promoting the role of women in the war effort, becoming honorary commandant of the Women's Royal Canadian Naval Service, the Canadian Women's Army Corps, and the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division. Their time at Rideau Hall, the official residence in Ottawa, was also crucial for another reason. They became hosts to a government in exile. Many of Europe's displaced royals, fleeing the Nazi occupation of their homelands, found sanctuary in Canada. Alice presided over a court that included Crown Princess Juliana of the Netherlands and Crown Prince Olav of Norway. It was during this period that the final painful chapter of her relationship with her brother, Charles Edward, was written. While she was in Canada rallying support for the war against Hitler, her brother was an active and unapologetic supporter of the Nazi regime. He had served as president of the German Red Cross, a position he used to advance Nazi policies, and was deeply involved with the Anglo-German Fellowship, an organization that promoted appeasement and closer ties with Hitler's Germany. For Alice, whose husband and country were fighting a life-and-death struggle against Nazism, her brother's actions were an unforgivable betrayal. After the war, Charles Edward was arrested, tried by a denazification court for his Nazi affiliations, and heavily fined, losing what remained of his fortune and living out his final years as a broken and isolated figure. The bond forged in a Victorian nursery was now utterly and irrevocably shattered by the ideological poisons of the 20th century. The Last Victorian, a witness to a century. When Princess Alice and the Earl of Athlone returned to Britain in 1946, they came home to a country that was victorious but exhausted and nearly bankrupt. This was not the triumphant globe-spanning empire of Alice's youth. It was a nation of ration books, bomb-damaged cities, and the first stirrings of a great imperial unraveling. For a woman born in the zenith of Victorian power, this new austere Britain could have been a source of disillusionment. But Alice, ever the pragmatist, adapted. Though they scaled back their most strenuous official duties, she certainly did not retire. Instead, she transitioned into a new and unique role, one she would inhabit for the final 3.5 decades of her life. That of a living monument, a tangible, breathing link to a past that was rapidly fading from living memory. As the years passed and her contemporaries disappeared, she became the last of her kind, a figure whose very existence was a source of public fascination and quiet reverence. Her longevity was staggering, a feat of endurance that mirrored her own resilient character. Born in the 46th year of Queen Victoria's reign, she lived through the entirety of the reigns of Edward VII, George V, Edward VIII, and George VI, and for nearly 3 decades into the reign of her great niece, Queen Elizabeth II. She had a personal adult perspective on each monarch. She remembered the formidable, almost mythical presence of her grandmother, Victoria. She witnessed the stark contrast of her uncle Edward VII's relaxed, pleasure-loving court. She had a close familial relationship with King George V and her sister-in-law, the formidable Queen Mary. She was a senior family member during the seismic shock of the abdication crisis in 1936, observing firsthand the family's turmoil as Edward VIII chose love over the throne. She had been a pillar of support for his brother, the shy, stammering George VI, during the dark days of the Second World War. And now she was the revered great-aunt to a new young queen, Elizabeth II. She attended the coronations of 1902, 1911, 1937, and 1953, a witness to the sacred ritual that bound a century of change. She saw the world transform from one of empires and monarchs to one of superpowers and ideologies, from the age of the telegram to the age of live television broadcasting those very coronations to the world. She personally knew figures who are now giants of history, from the last Tsar of Russia, her cousin Nikki, to every British Prime Minister, from the Victorian Lord Salisbury to the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. In her old age, her formidable character remained entirely undimmed. Far from becoming a frail, retiring dowager, she remained sharp, witty, outspoken, and possessed of a dry, sometimes caustic, sense of humor. Anecdotes about her abound. When a nervous young courtier once addressed her as "Your Royal Highness," she is said to have crisply retorted, "Don't be so formal. My friends call me Alice." She famously refused to give up driving until she was well into her 90s, seeing it as a surrender to old age. She continued to travel extensively well into her 80s, long after most people would have settled for a quiet life, undertaking journeys to the Middle East, and returning to her beloved Africa. Her love of hunting, a passion from her youth, also remained. Her memoirs, For My Grandchildren, published in 1966, reflect her personality perfectly. They are written in a direct, candid, and unsentimental style, refreshingly free of the platitudes that often characterize royal autobiographies. She speaks of her immense personal tragedies, the deaths of her father and her son, with a stoic acceptance that is both heartbreaking and deeply impressive. She focuses instead on her travels, her public work, and her sharp, often amusing observations of the people and places she encountered, her unique voice echoing from every page. As her contemporaries and cousins passed away, she became, from 1974, the sole surviving grandchild of Queen Victoria. This made her a figure of immense historical importance. To meet her in her final years at her apartment in Kensington Palace was, as one visitor remarked, like shaking hands with history itself. She was not just a person who had read about the Victorian era. She was a person who remembered it with perfect clarity. She could recall the specific rustle of her grandmother's black silk dress as she walked down a corridor, the scent of the pine trees at Balmoral, the particular atmosphere of Osborne House, and the faces of European royalty, czars, kaisers, and kings, who had long since been deposed, executed, or forgotten. She was a key figure in her great-niece's court, not as an artifact, but as a revered elder and a source of living memory. For a young queen navigating the modern world, Alice's presence at family gatherings was a direct link to the very source of their family's traditions and duties, a voice that could speak with authority of a world known to everyone else only through books. Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone, died peacefully in her sleep on January 3, 1981, just a few weeks shy of her 98th birthday. Her death occurred in a year that would see the monarchy seemingly revitalized by the fairy tale wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer. Her passing was a quiet, poignant counterpoint to that celebration, the final, gentle closing of one chapter of royal history as another, more turbulent one was about to begin. At the time of her death, she was the longest-lived British princess of royal blood, a testament to the same physical resilience that had defined her spirit. Her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the sacred space where she had been married, and where her parents' brief union had been blessed nearly a century before. The service was attended by the entire royal family, from Queen Elizabeth II to representatives from the few remaining European houses she had known all her life. Her death was not just the passing of a beloved family member. It was the severing of the final living thread connecting the 20th century to the Victorian age. The last person on earth who could speak with personal memory of Queen Victoria, the last person who could authentically say, "My grandmother, the Queen Empress," was gone. A book of history, not just a chapter, had closed. Legacy of an enduring spirit. To trace the 97-year lifespan of Princess Alice is to witness a human epic of survival, duty, and quiet courage. Her story begins in a world of gaslight and horse-drawn carriages, and ends in an age of space travel and nuclear anxiety. She was born into a family that ruled a quarter of the world's population and lived to see that empire transform into a voluntary commonwealth of nations. She was not a maker of history in the conventional sense. She did not command armies or dictate policy. Instead, she was something rarer and perhaps more profound. She was a consummate witness to history and a quiet hero in her own life's unrelenting drama. Her heroism was not found in a single grand gesture, but in the steadfast endurance she displayed over a lifetime. It was the heroism of a heart that could withstand the loss of a father, a brother, and a son, and still find the strength to serve. It was the heroism of a mind that could navigate the treacherous psychological terrain of having her husband and brother as mortal enemies and emerge with her own loyalty and purpose intact. It was the heroism of a spirit that refused to be defined by the genetic curse she carried, choosing instead to be defined by the boundless energy she gave to others. Her life is a powerful rebuttal to the fantasy of a fairy tale royal existence. It reminds us that behind the palace walls, the universal tragedies of the human condition play out with an intensity that privilege cannot assuage. Her story illuminates the immense personal cost of the great political conflicts of the 20th century, showing how international war becomes an intimate civil war within a family's heart. It casts a harsh light on the burden of heredity, on the random cruelty of a faulty gene passed down through generations. Yet to remember Alice only for her sorrows is to miss the true essence of her legacy. Her legacy is one of indomitable spirit. It is found in the laughter of the vicereine who charmed the people of Canada, in the resilience of the nurse who tended to wounded soldiers while her own heart was breaking, and in the sharp wit of the 90-year-old who refused to stop driving. She met every challenge, grief, war, loss, not with collapse, but with a renewed sense of duty. She was the ultimate Victorian in that sense, embodying the belief that character is forged in adversity and that service is the noblest response to suffering. She was the last of her kind, a woman of formidable strength and quiet dignity, a final living echo of a world long past, and an eternal testament to the enduring power of the human spirit.